over to Philippians, because note, this is so interesting to me. As I pointed out, they can read 100 verses in a row that completely contradict Islam, and then the 101st verse is something that could agree with Islam, and they'll say, "See, this entire passage is conclusive proof that Islam is true." It's very interesting stuff. But let me quote Philippians.
Zakir Naik.
Yeah, perfect. Let me quote Philip. Matter of fact, we can do an entire logical fallacies course just on the lectures of Zakir Naik.
Yeah.
So this is, let me give Philippians 2 here just as an example of Christian theology. So this is Philippians 2, starting at verse 5. Paul says, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God." Now notice he's in the in nature God, or in the form of God, depending on the translation. But he didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Now notice here, so he's somehow God and somehow distinct from God. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Notice, he's in nature or in the form of God, but he makes himself nothing and takes the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God, now that's interesting because again, Jesus is God and yet somehow distinct from God. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So Jesus is God, Jesus is Lord, but there's also God the Father, and Jesus is distinct from God the Father. How did Jesus appear as a man? Well, he took on the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. So once Jesus has taken on a human form, he is a servant. And what's interesting in all of this is that any Muslim who reads about Jesus being a servant will say, you see there, he's a Muslim. He's a Muslim. He's a servant. He's a servant of God. Not realizing, guys, we agree he's a servant. My goodness. If you take the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the incarnation, and the Son becomes incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, he is then a servant. You can't just say, here's something about him in that situation that confirms Islam, therefore Christianity is false, because Christianity views him as God. He became incarnate and became a servant, ladies and gentlemen, so that's not inconsistent with God. We believe that. We believe he was a servant. This is very, very strange. Now, so you want to talk about anything before I take a look at John 5?
No, I mean, also John is very, very one of the most blatant books in the Bible that shows Jesus as God. We'll talk about a place like John 8:58, John 14, Jesus appearing to Thomas, the very first chapter of John. Like to use verses out of John to try to argue Jesus didn't claim to be God is one of the most ridiculous things I've seen. It's just a clear example of quote mining.
Yeah, and the book literally begins by calling Jesus God, and then culminates with Thomas confessing him as my Lord and my God. But somehow they'll just see the parts where Jesus distinguishes himself from the Father in some sense, so they'll focus on those and say, "You see, he's not God." This is interesting stuff, but this is one of the clearest places in the Bible among the quotes that Muslims use, where they're just obviously, as you pointed out, quote mining. The entire passage can completely contradict Islam. They will zero in on one part that, once it's completely taken out of context, can be twisted into something supporting Islam, and they'll say, "Here's the proof." Zakir Naik quotes John 5 over and over and over again. But look at what actually happens. So there are two parts of this passage that Muslims quote. They'll quote verse 19 and they'll quote verse 30. Let's go ahead and start a couple verses earlier, and we'll do something they never do. We'll finish verse 19. They only quote the first part of verse 19. They ignore the second part of verse 19. Why? Because it completely contradicts Islam. They literally cannot finish a verse that they're quoting because it contradicts Islam. So let's earlier in this passage, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. So Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. And then we get down to, let's start at verse 16 here. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to be doing work on the Sabbath, and they viewed even healings as work. Watch how Jesus replies. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. So notice that already sounds like a claim to divinity. Human beings are not supposed to be working on the Sabbath. Jesus says, the Father is working, so I'm working too. Right. This is my goodness, this is the passage that Muslims are going to quote. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, the next verse is very clear. John is adding commentary onto what Jesus means by this, and he's going to know better than someone 500-600 years later.
Yep. But Jesus answered them, my Father. So just so everyone knows, the theological background is it's understood Jews are not allowed to work on the Sabbath. But the rabbis had a debate on whether God works on the Sabbath, because you do have a passage saying he rested, but it means that's rested in the sense of he stopped from what he was doing. But they had a debate because God is always upholding and sustaining the universe. So God works on the Sabbath if he's upholding and sustaining the universe. And so they have that debate going on among the rabbis. And then Jesus says, well, the Father's working, so I can work too.
Exactly.
So that really sounds like he's putting himself in the category of God, not of ordinary human being or even prophet.
In its cultural context, yeah, it's as John says in the next verse, he's making himself equal with God.
And this is who pointed this out? I was reading I can't remember what book it was. I was reading a book where he was pointing out in its cultural context, this isn't the same today because someone's like my sons might go off and do anything and it might be completely unrelated to what I do. But back in that context, you generally did what your dad did, right? If your dad is the butcher, you become the butcher because that's what you're going to be raised to be. If your dad is the carpenter, you end up being the carpenter. And so for someone to say that God is his father who's working and he's doing it, it's like you saying, hey, I'm carrying on the family trade here. But that's the work of God and not just random stuff. He's talking about even working on the Sabbath. But verse 18, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own father, making himself equal with God. That's how they understood his claim. Hey guys, I get to work on the Sabbath unlike you because my father does. And so this presents a problem for the Muslims. They had their sons by the tons response, where they say, "Oh, okay. Even if Jesus calls himself the Son, there are tons of sons of God in the Bible. Sons by the tons. Yeah, you can be a son of God in multiple senses. Don't commit an equivocation here, our Muslim friends, because as Jesus is using the Son, he is the unique Son. He's the divine Son. So they understood him by saying that he can work on the Sabbath because his father's working. They understood him to be calling God his own father, making himself equal with God. But notice there's a problem here. He's making himself equal with God. It sounds like they think he's calling himself a second God who's equal to God, right? And what does Jesus do? He corrects this misunderstanding. This misunderstanding that he's claiming to be some sort of second God, some alternate God. So Jesus said to them, Muslims will quote the first part of this. So Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord. You see there? The Son can do nothing of his own accord. Jesus is helpless. And then they stop there. The Son can do nothing of his own accord. You see, he's just a helpless servant. He's a helpless prophet. But notice, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. What? Muslims, can any Muslim in history say, whatever Allah does, I do all the exact same things? No. No, nope. That is not something a Muslim prophet should be saying. But what happens? The da'is will quote the first part of that verse say, you see, this supports Islam, they'll leave off the second part of the verse. Even you've got this father-son language, and then this is clearly not a son of God in the sense that, oh, we're all children of God. It's not talking like that. This is whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing, and greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. Right? So the Father raises the dead, the Son also raises the dead. And Muslims wouldn't technically have a problem with this, except the Father-Son language, but they would, because they'll be thinking of it in terms of Jesus just miraculously raising a person from the dead. But no, he does not stop there. He does not stop there. Jesus is talking about raising the dead at the resurrection here in a second. Watch this. For the verse 22, for the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Muslims, read verses 22 and 23 very carefully when your da'is quote this as affirming Islam. The Father judges. What's that?
Could you imagine a Muslim prophet saying that I deserve all the honor Allah deserves?
Yeah, and notice, Muslims, who's the final judge of everything, ladies and gentlemen? Who's the final judge at the judgment? Allah, right? But this says that the Father doesn't judge. He's given all judgment to the Son. So, and why does the Father do this? That all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Why, in the name of common sense, would you honor a prophet the same way that you honor the Father or Allah or whatever you want to say? Why would you honor a mere prophet as you honor God? The only way you honor someone the same way you honor God is if that person has the nature and attributes of God. So is this confirming Islam? No. Whoever does not honor the Son, notice this is a massive condemnation of Islam. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Muslims, did Muhammad honor the Son the same way that he honors the Father? No. So Jesus condemns Muhammad and said he's not honoring God. This is the passage you're going to support Islam. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my words and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. The dead will be raised because of the voice. They hear the voice of the Son of God. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. Did you catch that, ladies and gentlemen? An hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice. Whose voice? The voice of the Son of God. Those who have done good, they come out to the resurrection of life. Those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. Who raises the dead? Now, let me correct that. Muslims, according to Islam, who raises the dead at the resurrection? Allah. According to John chapter 5, which your da'is quote endlessly to support Islam, supposedly, who raises the dead at the resurrection? Jesus. So Jesus is Allah, according to this passage. Again, according to Islam, who's the final judge? Allah. According to this passage, who's the final judge? Jesus. According to Islam, who raises the dead at the resurrection? Allah. According to this passage, who raises the dead at the resurrection? Jesus. How in the name of common sense are you quoting this to support Islam? And here you have, so what, that's the context. That's the context of verse 30, which our friends quote to show that Jesus is just a devout Muslim servant. What's he say? I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. You see there, IP? Jesus was a Muslim. He's only come to do the will of the one who sent him. You see it? So anyway, that's what happens when we actually look at the context of one of these passages that these guys quote. Isn't this interesting?
Yeah. trying to use John to argue Jesus isn't God is like trying to shoot a gun backwards, like the gun backwards. I mean, like you're just gonna hurt yourself. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, this is my goodness. And it's like disheartening that we're dealing with. I mean, which da'is don't do this? Muslims, name a da'i who does not do this, who does not just completely distort the meaning of passages in order to deceive his listeners. And what's amazing is you can show Zakir Naik doing something like this. So Zakir Naik quotes John 5:30 endlessly. You can sit down with a Muslim and say, okay, let's read this passage in context. What is Jesus actually saying in John chapter 5, verse 30? What was the accusation against him? Because he said that since the Father works, he gets to work too. The accusation was, you're claiming to be another God. You're claiming to be another equal with God. Jesus' response is, what are you talking about? His claim is that he's not some separate God. He's one, right? Mm-hmm. He's one with the Father. So you can think about this differently, and then we'll get back to the videos. But all of that was to show. Think about if you were examining this as evidence, if you treated John chapter 5 as evidence that's either going to confirm Christian theology or Muslim theology. Now, it's possible that neither theology is correct. If you're just like approaching this philosophically and so on, you say, okay, there's Christian theology, there's Islamic theology, and then it's possible that they're both wrong. Doesn't seem possible that they could both be right. But the passage we read in Philippians 2, that's a good encapsulation of Christian theology. Jesus is in nature God, but he's distinct from the Father. He becomes incarnate, takes on the nature of a servant, right? So think of Christian theology. If Christian theology is correct, the Christian theology of Jesus is correct, what should we expect Jesus to affirm? We should expect him to affirm that he is divine, that he has a divine nature, but that he has entered creation as a servant, and that he is distinct from the Father, and yet he's not a separate God from the Father. That's what you would expect Jesus to affirm if Christian theology is true. If Islamic theology is true, Jesus is just a created prophet. He's Allah's a father to no one. No one is a son of God. Allah's the one who judges who judges people at the final judgment. Allah's the one who raises the dead, and Jesus is, he's just a mere servant. Once we read this passage, which theology is being confirmed there? Massive confirmation for Christian theology, massive disconfirmation for Islamic theology. What do Muslim da'is do? They go to the one part, I can of my own self do nothing. They focus just on that. They ignore everything else, and they say, see, this affirms Islamic theology. Guys, is that a good method? I regard that as like insanely, massively deceptive. Like if someone made that argument, to be clear, when an average Muslim makes that claim, I don't think the Muslim's trying to deceive me. I think he's never read the passage before. When Zakir Naik makes that claim, and Zakir Naik has read the passage, I think you are such a deceiver. This is despicable. This is despicable behavior. And they would never. You could line up 1,000 Zakir Naik fans, explain this to all of them. This wouldn't bother any of them. For some reason, they just don't care. But if you did that to them, if you ripped a verse out of context, completely distorted the meaning of the Quran, suddenly they care. Very interesting.